I am an elementary music teacher, and my principal has asked that I bring computer science into my lessons. Help. Where do music and computer science principles align?
Yeah, so I really like this question, and I'm going to spend more time answering this and kind of diving deeper than some of the other questions, just to kind of set the grounds here. The so my dissertation had a lot of themes and sub-themes that blurred these boundaries between music making and computer science education. So my PhD is in music education, but the dissertation itself talked a lot about people making music with retro video game hardware and like old computers. So it's music called chip tunes. So people who made this music were discussing it in a discussion forum. There were like 10,000 members in there, and they had like 11 million words of data that I looked at and kind of like came up with these different themes and whatnot. So the themes primarily talked about composition practices, performance practices. This is like music composition and performance. And then something I'm calling maker practices, coding practices, entrepreneurial practices, visual art practices, and community practices. So within all of these, it like really blurred these boundaries and kind of made me question, well, when is this a computer science practice or principle or concept? And when is this a music one? And there wasn't really a clear answer. And when the members of the discussion forum actually spoke about it, they said that it was inseparable. So when it came to coding some types of music, they said you cannot do this without engaging in both code and music. So what I'd recommend is trying to find spaces or ways of engaging that kind of have similar alignment, whether it is chiptunes or whatever. So to more directly kind of answer your question, however, and by the way, if you want to, the dissertation is available for free. It's called Corpus Assisted Discourse Analysis of Music Related Praxis discussed within chipmusic.org. It's a mouthful. It's for free on my website under the publication section. But let's actually like dive into this a little bit. So a lot of the engagement that you'll find, and I'll kind of talk about this a little bit more in some of the other questions. Like if you were to create music in Scratch, it's pretty obvious when to be able to align the algorithms and programming standards that Wyoming has. However, it's a little harder for some people, especially music educators, no offense, to figure out how to align the music standards with computer science standards. So I actually kind of want to go through those for a moment, just to kind of talk about it. So if we look at, this is just for the grades 9 through 11, but you can do this with K through 4 and through 5 through 8. But in the music standards, in standard 1, we have the very first like substandard that's talking about refining musicianship through individual practice. And it's great. The people who were performing in this discussion forum were doing so. And so that would address that standard. However, they built their instruments. So these electronic instruments were often built by themselves for the purpose of making music. And because these are electronic instruments, they often had to engage in all sorts of hardware manipulation, even like literally designing hardware like chips and being able to make it so that you could interface with these old devices and then turn like an Atari into a guitar. And then you have a Guitari. Like there's a lot of really cool things that people were doing. So cool, that addresses standard 1. So standard 2 is to be able to perform independently and with others. So a lot of these people were doing so not only with the electronic instruments that they built, but they also had like groups with like a tuba and a banjo, a Game Boy Advance, and then like a vocalist. Like they were doing this in clubs, they were doing this online, etc. Awesome, we've addressed that standard. The next one is to be able to improvise rhythms and melodies, etc., to be able to like create music in a different style. Now, this was the number one thing that they talked about was composing and improvising, etc., and doing all of these things that are listed under standard 3. And that's out of 11 million words of data. So they discuss this quite a bit. And that also addresses standard number 4, which is the composing and arranging music. Now we also have music literacy through notating music. Now, this one, for some music educators, when they look at it, they might see the ways that people engage in this intersection between music and computer science and go, but that's not Western standardized notation. You're right. They might not be using that. Instead, they might be using MIDI, or they might also use some of the staff notation, or they just might use code. They might use a language called ABC notation, where you're literally just writing out the letters and then it performs it for you. If we actually zoom out a little bit and look at, well, what do you mean by music literacy? There are so many ways that you can engage in music making and computer science if you just broaden your definition of what does it mean to be musically literate. So the next set of standards that's on music, we have standard number 2, which is aesthetic perception. So this first substandard under here is talking about analyzing compositional devices and techniques. They frequently talked about comparing algorithms as well as comparing albums and songs, etc. So we've got that one. And the next substandard is responding to oral examples by evaluating musical elements. So they asked for critique. There is, in fact, a subform specific to critique on music where people would submit their works in progress and say, hey, can I get some feedback on this? So we've got that one as well. They also evaluated their own and others people's performances. They did this not only with their code or compositions, but also like live performances. And again, got some feedback on there. And then the last substandard under this particular one is about forming and defending preferences for musicians. There's a lot of discussions on, well, which chip musicians do you like? Or is this type of chiptune actually chiptune, or is it something called fake bit, which was this really interesting argument about if you used the wrong type of hardware for this, was it then actually legitimate music? Which gets into some historical and cultural context, which is the third main standard for musicians or for music in Wyoming. So this one, again, I just mentioned the very first standard in there. So the second one is talking about analyzing characteristics that cause a work to be considered historically or culturally significant. So creating requires an understanding of that style or period. So a lot of people, when they engage in this music, they would actually create like jazz or hip hop or progressive rock in this particular style of electronic music making that required a lot of computer science background to do. So I'd argue that you actually are engaging in that one. And the next one is students evaluating the various purposes of music and selecting music for a specific purpose. So this is often done, they would do for live performances. They also created chip tunes for like commercials or for movie scores or video games, etc. So far we've hit every single standard on here. And we can do the exact same thing for the artistic connections in the very last standard 4 that's on here. We could talk about digital citizenship, how it's not just about the music, but the actual musical tools and instruments that are being designed, manufactured, built, etc. And then we could even talk about the entrepreneurship. So long story short, every single one of the music standards can relate to just this one subgenre of music making that happens to blur these intersections of computer science and music. But the thing that it requires for a lot of music educators is to think of how these two fit and really kind of evaluating not only like what students will know and understand, but how they can actually do that. So the how can be up to the communities, the districts, the individual educators, or even students to figure this out. So if you look at the standards, it doesn't say that you're going to do all of these things in band class or in orchestra class or general music, which is often the case in elementary school, and also happens to be the most broad of the like main categories of music education. So if we look at the standards, and my argument is what we typically see is standard, substandard 1 and 2. That's about 99% of what you see in most large ensembles is performing alone or with others and refining that performance. That's it. None of the other stuff. So if you're looking at some of the like music and CS stuff that's discussed in my dissertation, and then here's a link that hopefully you can include in the show notes of some podcasts where I kind of unpack some publications that explore this, more examples in some publications that I've done. I would argue that a lot of what is being talked about in those podcast episodes and those publications can very easily be done in music classes and actually address the remainder of those standards that likely are not actually discussed in music education context. This excerpt of the CSTA podcast is from episode number 169. It's called Computer Science and Music, CSTA Wyoming interview.